Welcome back to The Corner of Stirring Game, the podcast where narrative meets design and every story lives at the edge of interactivity. Today, we're joined by Sagar Beroshi, principal narrative designer at the Chinese Room, known for his recent work on Siren's Rest, an expansion for the psychological horror game Still Wakes the Deep. Sagar brings deep experience in designing narratives that linger, especially in games that want to evoke emotion, tension, and dread. In this episode, we're focusing on a genre that's near and dear to many people's hearts this time of year, horror. But along the way, we also explore the business side of game development, including the gritty realities of what happens when you don't have the budget or resources to execute your ideal narrative choices. So let's get into it. Sagar, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's great.
I am excited to sit down and chat with you today about all kinds of things. We're talking about horror a little bit, talking about the narrative cascade a bit, talking about the life of a creative and being a parent and all of this fun stuff. But before we dig into some of the meaty stuff, I do like to set the stage with your origin story. How did you fall in love with gaming, creating? Did you play a lot as a kid? What are you playing these days? Just take us through your life journey,
Yeah, absolutely. I can totally do that. Like I imagine a lot of people you've had on your show, I've loved games as a consumer for so much of my life, right? Like, I grew up playing games. I never quite stopped. I grew up in a part of the world that was wonderful, and I had a lot of a great context around me, great support. I had a big sprawling family, but I absolutely had no contact to anyone in games or anyone who ever worked in entertainment. The very idea was very alien, right? Like I didn't even think about it rationally. It sort of felt like less likely than becoming an astronaut or something, when obviously there's like a big, massive industry that supports these things. So I came to games actually as a result really late in my career. I think I'm perhaps a little unusual, not just in coming late. There are many people who moved into it, but I spent a lot of my 20s, frankly, exploring a wide range of industries, hoping that I was like at the thing that was right for me. I counted at one point, and depending on how finely you slice it, I think I must have worked in like 10 different sectors at this point. Like I've just ranged from, I worked in secondary schools that were all very experimental and sort of pan-continental. I worked for a magazine at one point. I had a career in the main part of my career that I was pushing forwards was one as a technocrat, one in politics and in government. So I was a regulator. I worked on political campaigns. And at one point I worked in pharmaceuticals. I mean, it's a really wide range of things that I've done. So it was in my 30s that I came into games. And part of it, frankly, was through just exposure to a different area. I've really come to believe that there is nothing more powerful than being around the type of people who are around any sort of people, really, who are doing work that you find interesting, because you will very quickly learn. It will become humanized. It will become more specific. It will become more obvious what the path is or what people might do. It's not just an abstraction. It's not just whatever the top headline is of what an industry represents, but the sort of the actual graft of day-to-day work becomes so much clearer. So for me, it was actually when I moved to the UK. So we're talking right now, it's nighttime here in London. And I have been in the UK now for quite a long time. And it's been a blast. But one interesting thing about the UK is that the games industry is very large relative to its size in North America. And I mean, just relative population wise. So I think it must be the case that there is a larger overall games industry in terms of volume of workers, perhaps, and maybe almost certainly the amount of money that flows through it, say in the US and Canada in particular. But sort of pound for pound, based on the sort of 60 million population in the UK, it's massive. And part of that is because it shares a language and it has a huge export market in North America, right? Some of the most sort of American style games, particularly the sort of, United States focus, are made here, right? I mean, it's like Rockstar is based here. They make the GTA games here. Right? They have spent, one thing you sort of end up realizing the second you move out of the US or sort of spend some time elsewhere is people tend to know a lot more about your country than you do about theirs, right? So like the Brits are real expert observers of the American condition. And so I think it makes them pretty competitive in this space. So it's just, the upshot of that is that if you're generally in Southern England, there are people who work in games that you will just run into all the time. You know, you will, there will be meetups, there will be organizations, there will be hubs, there will be places where games have been being made since the 90s or earlier, that, you know, a huge amount of experience. So just being in that sort of vibrant space was pretty cool. You know, like games are always, perhaps not always, but they're often sort of third or fourth fiddle to some other related industry. And particularly because of how skewed money and wealth is in the States these days, the biggest sort of game cities in the US in particular, Canada is a different story, but in the US in particular, they're so overshadowed, say in San Francisco, by the overall tech scene, or in LA by the overall film scene and general entertainment, that they at least when I was there, it's now been a while, things have changed, they would always sort of be a rounding error. So yeah, it is different, I think, particularly in Edmonton and in Montreal and other key hubs in Canada, I think. But I didn't have exposure to those places as much. So yeah, so coming to the UK, it's been a pretty amazing thing. So yeah, that's how I made it into games. I knew more intentionally I wanted to come in, so I applied cold. I just sort of did like a big spray of a number of cold LinkedIn contacts and just kind of got lucky. It was hard to even know what type of functional role I would be able to be qualified for. I mean, you look at all these job descriptions, and you know, inevitably the most junior role requires like 3 years of experience already doing a thing, and you're like, you don't even know how you can compete with any of these things, but you feel as like a 30-year-old that you have some sort of potentially useful skill to give. It's really hard to even know what that is. I mean, I just found like the plethora of free content so helpful in that regard, like GDC talks, personal recommendations people would do for a specific field or specific industry. The amount of available resources that exist online now is really, really rich. And so all of that was pretty helpful. So yeah, it's only kind of been in the second half of my career that I moved into games. But it was only really a shift of mindset when I was able to start to think of it as like, oh, this is like a thing I could do. This is a career that might be worth doing. So sorry for the long and rambling answer, but
no, that's the perfect answer. Why narrative? Well, how did you wander into?
That is a very good question. Okay, so I suppose because I had tried out so many things before I came to games, I really knew what I wanted to do. So I play games of all sorts. I love games of all sorts. I love loads of games that have a very low emphasis on narrative, right? That don't care that much about narrative. You know, I mean, I will say that like Mario has a narrative. It is a bonkers, completely trippy narrative, but there is a story in there. You just don't care about it that much because it's a game that cares so much more about the sort of mechanical side of the triangle, of Jesse Schell's triangle than the narrative one, and that's fine. You know, you can have lots of fun with that. But that was where I wanted to have my impact. I knew that from the start. It was sort of game storytelling, the option of owning a story, of interacting with it, of making it your own, that I think many of your guests have sort of described as being a real surge of excitement when you realize what abilities you have. I mean, there to some degree there's a dance that happens here between the player and the developer, because they're of course creating a space for you to then feel that way, right? But the sort of hidden way that it might be evoked, that's the art of it, right? Like that's where the art of narrative design comes in. So maybe it was helpful that I came into the industry a little bit later, because by the point I was coming in, the way that narrative people in games tended to work had shifted, economically speaking, right? It tended to be for a really long time, and it's still true for many people, that the main way that narrative happens in games is through a writer, and words are always thought of as cheap in games, right? You know, whether they are or not. That's a question, right? And so it was very common that you would sort of make a game, you would find the fun, and then you would hire a writer at the beginning to help give you some initial spark of like a world or an idea, or at the end to like tie together a bunch of these cool levels that you had come up with. And I think that was not an unusual way of dealing with things in the 2000s and beyond. It wasn't that we didn't have really good narrative games, but they were less the norm, right? And when they did become the norm, even then you might have a creative director that was structuring a bunch of these things, but there might not be a deep bench of narrative people. There would just be sort of the central creative owner. Right. But by the time I was coming into the industry, it was much more common for that role to either come in-house for an extended period of time, and there was a sort of new role, the narrative designer role, that had broken apart and become its own thing, become identified as its own thing. What does that even mean, right? I mean, all game developers originally were were just done. All of those roles were done by programmers in the 70s and 80s. Every single one, right? Art, music, story, whatever it was done in these like old, like, you know, in these old text-based adventures or whatever it is that you might be making. And over time, different segments would break out. You know, first art broke out, and then sort of VFX broke out from art, or design would then break out from programming a little bit further. And from design came all these other things. And, you know, narrative design is a particularly late subfield to break out. And it's following the exact same pattern that so many other now relatively well-defined subfields have. Audio went through the same process. We don't think of audio as just like a subset of either design or of code. But it did used to be thought of that way. You know, I mean, VO used to be thought of in that way too, as like, oh, it's just like it's an optional nice to have and something. So, you know, narrative design will kind of go through the same cycle. So it's quite interesting to arrive into the industry at the point at which the type of role I wanted was both available, more often than not in-house, inside of a developer, was given a little bit more respect, but there was also a huge amount of opportunity, right? It wasn't yet fully defined what that role was. Two companies with that same title would have a very different role available. You would quickly be able to learn a lot. And in such an environment of ill definition, there's opportunity, right? So yeah, so that's kind of what I found. And so it's made it doubly interesting for me, both interesting substantively for the work I'm doing, but also interesting in terms of how you learn how to make art with other people in a group.
With such a varied background coming into it, were there skills or experiences you were able to apply from other industries that helped you get into that role?
Yeah. You know, the funny thing about being a generalist, I suppose, is you sort of spend your school years being told how valuable it is to be a generalist and how useful it will be. It will give you all these general skills. And then you spend your 20s regretting that completely, because no one wants a 22-year-old who's a generalist, right? Like it's useless to them. They want you to come in and do a specific job and just prove that you know how to be an adult, because that itself, that bar is very hard for people to clear sometimes. I mean, it's been very hard for me to clear at times, right? So in retrospect, I understand it. But just when I had written it off, like this wide sense of experience of like, this has just been an unproductive way that I have used my first working decade. It has absolutely turned out to help, hugely turned out to help in ways that you never expect. But of course, it's not, you know, that's not really what's happened. What's happened is you slowly, almost subconsciously, contrive a way to work on projects and contribute to projects in such a way that lights up the specific skill set that you already have, or that you know that you can make use of. So yes, at first it was just a general sense of patterns, right? There's a lot of things I think in the games industry that we feel like this is a really unique, like a really difficult pattern. It's not clear what we would do here, when it's like a quite solved problem in many fields. There's many different ways that things had worked. So I'll give you an example. So I worked on in a regulator for the Obama administration for a long time, and I learned a ton about old school regulation styles and the old school, supposedly, industries that received them or interacted with the government in this way. Things that feel so removed or irrelevant from games, but the closer you look at them, the more you're like, but there's a lot of interesting lessons here for how power gets structured in a space and what is likely to happen. The structure that we've had of, you know, a flash of new technology for a new console generation or something, a general wave of this movement towards increasing competition, but centered in a few key platform holders that eventually sort of get broken apart by a new arrival of technology. I mean, the defining thing of the last 15 years has been the breakdown of distribution of games, that anyone can get access to games anywhere, and the dramatic drop in cost of game production, right? But the evangelization of Unreal and Unity, and the ability for many people quite cheaply to do things that previously always had to be invested in-house. You know, film went through this exact same cycle. In the 40s, it was going through its studio phase. It had a ton of consolidation, people who were vertically or like integrated up and down. It sounds a lot like the 90s, when you would have to go to Nintendo and get approval to get your title out, and they would have a relationship with the retail shop, and they would confirm whether you can do that or not do that, right? And, you know, like the sort of drop in the cost of technology is not that different from film in the 60s, when suddenly everyone could make something, and we would get or in the 50s really, and we got this explosion in the 60s of auteur-driven cinema. You know, we get we see the emergence of all of these individual characters who actually can get their specific singular vision out into a game nowadays. That was much harder to do before. It would happen in the 80s and 90s, of course it would, but relatively speaking, those hits are happening in a bigger and bigger way, in a way that's more visible. More of the audience even knows who they are. All of those are cycles, right? Like they're cycles that happen. And I don't know, I think with that knowledge, you end up feeling less riven by events, I guess, especially in a period where the industry goes through some trouble. You're like, it's not like anyone has an answer. Games are unique in their own way, but it's not. We're not the only industry to have confronted a challenge like this. It's cold comfort, right? If you're impacted on the downswing of one of these things, but it does give you the sense that as long as there's enough vibrance in a market, that little sort of like bingo canister keeps turning, and something will come out eventually, right? It might not be quite what you expect. It might not be from the place you expect. Here's a good example, right? Another thing, 15 years ago, we would have thought that the center of RPG production, of Western RPG production, was very clearly focused in the big hitters, right? RPGs or action RPGs were being made so well in sort of in the US and in Canada. BioWare had a huge and amazing reputation. They were doing incredibly well. There were plenty of other titles that were coming out that were doing increasingly well too. And if you move from 2010 to 2025, the center of gravity has moved so heavily towards Europe, so heavily, right? You might not play every single one of these games, but you could not question that the existence of Larian, Guerrilla, CD Projekt Red, all happening to be in Europe you couldn't say that that's all an accident, right? Like there's a sort of shift in energy that you might not have anticipated, right? And it's not that other people aren't doing it. Expedition 33 having been coming out, there was always a lot of talent in all of these places, but the shifts are sometimes a little bit unpredictable. But it keeps things exciting, it keeps things vibrant.
And this is completely off topic, I'm wandering down a side hole, but is there a migration of talent to Europe? Because I mean, I know people who have gone off to work on Eve in mine. I guess that's not Europe, but up in Greenland, Iceland, and there's people. There is a lot of people talking about going to Europe to work.
Yeah, part of the issue is that there's some truly insane stat that I don't know perfectly, but something like 70% of the AAA game job cuts have happened in California. Something like this, right? There is clearly an impact happening due to the cost of labor in the most expensive parts of the US and Canada. So like the number of jobs in Vancouver and Montreal and in San Francisco and LA have dropped significantly. If there is a place where people are effectively able to organize around that type of talent, but still be able to get access to publisher capital to pitch an idea and pursue it, it could be well situated for that, right? I mean, like Europe is exactly where you might expect these things to happen. There's a long and great history of sort of educational support, focus on tech, focus on some of the type of vocational careers that, by the way, there's a type of educational infrastructure here that I never saw in the States. I know it exists now. And that it's existed for a while. There's places like DigiPen and many other games-focused educational institutions, but in general, like our preference in North America for Renaissance-based education and our general down preference for vocational training has meant that an industry like this that kind of sits somewhere in between, we sort of left an opening, you could say. But in Europe, they're everywhere, right? Like you can find a games program in every major country that has games studios, and they all have relationships with the local studios. They have a pipeline of talent, too much even, right? So there's all these people who are coming out incredibly skilled, way more skilled than I certainly was when I tried to enter the industry, who are hungry, right? And that there's downsides to that. I mean, I think you could argue that it competes down wages a little bit, as wages are already significantly lower in general in Europe than they are in North America. But that very reason might mean that someone who has a sort of New York branch for their financing and an Amsterdam branch for their financing is like, well, I can fund in the EU and we'll go that much farther. I mean, the cold like capitalist calculus of this can be can feel really harsh. It's not like ideal to feel at the mercy of those things. But I think if you sit back and you observe like, well, what's happened with where investments have occurred, it's interesting, right? It's interesting who owns what. My company. So I work for the Chinese Room right now. So the Chinese Room is a studio really known for its narrative. We're based in Brighton. We are about to very soon release Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. A big, it's an RPG, it's an action RPG. It's set in a big existing universe, right? Like that universe is Vampire the Masquerade. It's part of World of Darkness. World of Darkness, I think, I really ought to know this by heart, but I think it was originally developed kind of around the Midwest, like where I'm from. I grew up outside of Chicago. I think that's right.
Wolf, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where White Wolf originated. But they're owned by the Swedes now, right? Like Paradox owns them. That's where they're making investments amongst the people and the context that they have. There's no reason why they wouldn't start in time zones that they can more easily travel to. So we certainly found it beneficial, right, to be able to have a good partner in them. So yeah, I mean, it's hard because there's a big chicken and an egg problem. It's like, well, if you're in a country that doesn't have any of these resources, neither publishers nor studios, and you are a big game developer, that hurts, right? Because you feel like, well, then I don't have there's nothing much I can do. How do you start that?
Right.
This is where like Canada does do things a bit differently. Like there is, or at least has been for a long time until it has been recently starting to change, state support in Canada. Where I grew up, there was never, like the states never did there was never any sort of active government support for the arts that wasn't through some sort of public-private company like NEA or something like that. It would never even occur, right, to people that would be a place that they could get funding. So that's fine. It just means like the subsidy that is so often offered in Europe and is kind of built in as part of a desire to keep each local culture strong. All of that contributes. It means that there's like a meeting ground, a space that you can have events. Okay, another good example. BAFTA. BAFTA is historically a really respected institution, and they have really put a concerted effort into becoming a forum for game makers in the UK and being a place to evangelize games, being a place where people can do talks and master classes about games, and treating it like they do the other media. They see the writing on the wall. They see that it's a growing industry. They want it to have some credence. And so, there's an awards ceremony, there's a whole structure, there's memberships, they actively recruit, they sort of tell you, hey, if you want to start a company, look at all of these ways you can get tax credits for it or make it cheap to get your first game. They convene these sessions and things. So sometimes just having like a convening force is really helpful, and perhaps many of those things exist in the States now too. Ironically, because I only entered the industry heavily after leaving, I don't know. So it might be that many of these things have always existed, and I just didn't quite know. But the overall sense I have is that those institutions are less well developed in many parts of the States. You're a little bit more on your own.
Oh, that makes sense. That's too bad though, but I get you. We are going to dig into the horror topic, but I was talking to Willem the other day about what you're talking about, how this emergence of lots of games, the ability for people to get in with a lower bar of entry and an easier or lower cost, and there's not as much control over the distribution now, and that means all these indie games, and there's this huge explosion of indie games. And I was comparing it to how back in the early 2000s when D&D released D20 and allowed everybody to open source, and suddenly you were flooded by stuff, and there were some beautiful games that came out of that. We got Monty Cook's games out of that, but we also there was a lot of crap.
Yeah, there's a lot of shovelware too. Yeah. So like, what do you do with that, or is that sort of a good or a bad thing? Look, I think it's useful to use the TTRPG example. I think, right. So let's take like Dungeon Masters Guilds or Storytellers Vault or Drive Through RPG or these places where you can sort of build and upload your own tabletop RPG campaign, right? As a metaphor, you see a lot of content there. It's very hard to think through and to know exactly what to do. But that's fundamentally like a sorting problem, right? Like that's a problem that like that place as a platform can do for you. They can have star ratings or awards or something, sales awards, and you can sort that way. And things could rise to the top that way. you could have a sort of recommendation system outside. Your favorite subreddit for adventure games will be like, you really have to like do this specific mystery. It's better than everything else, right? And it sort of does really well. All of that is slightly inexact, and the downside of it is that it does devolve a lot of power to that platform holder, whoever it is, and that's happened here in digital games too, right? So eventually you end up seeing, if there's too much power that gets accumulated in one of those holders, you will start to see people nipping at its heels, right? So everything that Valve has been going through over these last couple of years is emblematic of that, right? Like they have done very well, and well enough that people are like, this is not a fair distribution, right? But the same thing has happened to the App Store, and has been codified, right, in regulation in many places. So it's interesting to kind of observe those things occurring, particularly for mobile games. But what's been happening with Steam has just been the same model has sort of the same arguments have been applied to Steam that way. So is it a good thing that many people can make games? Clearly, yes. Right? Like clearly we get some amazing ideas. So like, would I have had Toby Fox if it wasn't for this type of open distribution? Surely not, right? I think surely some of these ideas just wouldn't have germinated otherwise. It's just like the 60s with film, right? Like you just get these extraordinary things that become incredibly influential. So amazing things can bubble to the top. But if you believe in your game, you think you've like really thought through your audience, you have something really solid, but you have no idea how to break through, it's really demoralizing. Right? You feel like there are so few levers you have to improve or fix things or change things. And then I think like there's sort of a deeper, meatier thing that everyone kind of wants to know a bit of, that is very difficult to know, and that is the shift in taste for game genre. Everyone wants to sort of everyone these days like wants to fund another Vampire Survivors game, right? Like everyone wants to do like a game like this, but games take a long time to make, right? Like even the smallest game is going to be taking like some years to make. By the time it comes out, how sure are you that there's still going to be a market for that specific subgenre? Or fill in the blank, whatever your specific thing is, right? Everyone is that's happening at the pitch stage, right? That's happening where like a developer comes with an idea to a publisher, and they're like, look, this idea has legs, and I'll tell you why it has legs, and then they have to do the research to confirm it. They have to say, this had this many sales, this genre had this many sales, like whatever, the leading title in it did this well in 2016 and did this well in 2018 and this well in 2020. Sure, you never know the future, but is it a reasonable bet to make? Fine. And then, the publisher can sort of discount that accordingly. Like it's not a perfect science, but I mean, I think that this matchmaking process is important. It's important if you want games to be made, if you want your own game to be made, if you want to have ownership over what that is. Like it's important that you as a developer start to feel like some knowledge over it. Sorry, I am conscious that we have been getting very businessy in a lot of these things, and I didn't mean to be. I mean, it's the sort of it's the sort of narrative bits of games that that's where I spend most of my time thinking. But I guess I find that like it's really common for someone to disappear into the craft of their work, and there's something so beautiful about that, right? Like you're an author, you'll sit down, you will focus, you will produce extraordinary prose, and you will just really focus on doing that really, really well. But sometimes you will be screwed no matter what you do because of some sort of macro effect that you don't have influence over. If it is just the period of the console wars where you can't get anything made independently and you have to essentially go through some sort of licensed IP for it to work, then maybe your idea will never be able to fly. When if it simply had occurred 20 years later, it would have been fine, perhaps, right? Would we have gotten Owl Boy in the Super Nintendo era? Like probably not, right? Like probably not. But these games, like they have to be able to start from somewhere. And I think so often when you are heads down as a creative working in your craft, you feel buffeted by these forces. You feel like I have no power. I'm at the mercy of these things. And I hate feeling like that. Like I hate feeling like not in control over my destiny, even if it might be a little bit true, right? And so it does strike me that like it is helpful to zoom out, and it is helpful to learn about as much as you can about these things, and try to get a handle about how the market works in your specific subgenre, your specific field. Because even if the answers you find are not incredibly popular, like even if you find that your deep passion is visual novels that are like dark romances, that there's some ceiling more or less on how many sales you're likely to get. Surely with that knowledge, you can do something, right? You can sort of say like, you know what? I'm gonna turn this. I don't actually need it to be that visual. I can turn this into like a choice of games format, like pure text adventure, and I can actually create way more. I can include many more mechanics because I'm not going to be spending as much of my effort on these other things. Or you can say, no problem, I'm still going to go forward, but it teaches me that, you know what, I probably can't afford a full-time artist co-founder. I'm gonna have to cobble that together in my own way, or through contracting work in some, like, it gives you power, right? Gives you knowledge. Not everyone is independent and working on their own title. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I would guess most people are in a company or are sort of employees somewhere, and your scenario is different. But in a world in which you feel like you might be laid off for reasons not at all to do with you, and suddenly you are at the mercy of this big open market, it's helpful to know what your options are, I guess. Mm-hmm. And those options themselves are formed in a context, right? They don't just magically appear. They exist because of what you have to offer, what someone is looking for, and whether you can find a fit between those things. Yeah.
It's interesting that games are such an art form as much as they are a business. And if you can strip away the business considerations sometimes and just say, okay, I need to tell this story in a way that people engage with it in a certain way. Maybe I can figure out a way to do it in a tabletop space, or maybe I can figure out a way to do it in a board game, or maybe it's, me and two friends making Balatro. Like,
well, yes, exactly. Like, this is exactly the same process you do when you are coming up with say a narrative game concept, which I've been able to do quite a lot. Right? When you come up with a concept, or you are a creative director of a project, you are constantly dealing with this exact same challenge, just for slightly different questions, right? You will have a question. This is just like, so we talked at the beginning about the narrative cascade, right? This works for within every single department too. When you're sort of a working Joe on a game, right? You are constantly posed this question of, what is the ideal of what you want for this moment? And if you can't do it, what then? Right? You always ask that question, these sort of two directions, and you need to know both, and neither of them are easy to find out. It's hard to know how you are gonna, what content you want for a specific thing. If someone says, cool, I'm gonna be making a lava level, but it's gonna be set near a city or something, and my characters are gonna go through, and there's gonna be some sort of antagonist that in some way is connected to the sort of volcanic space that's in here. That's the prompt you have. You have to come up with a bunch of characters. Maybe you have to come up with that mini boss, like who that antagonist is, what they sort of say, what they're about. You're like, there's 1,000 ways you could do that scene or that moment. So many ways, right? You might say, great. You know what I'm going to have? I'm going to have like a cutscene. There's going to be like lava bubbling in the background. There's going to be like soaring music. There's going to be not just the one mini boss, that he's going to have a ton of henchmen, and we're going to create new characters for every single one of these people. And you can have this as like the top part of the cascade. Should everyone agree with you? Should you be able to convince everyone that is the moment to sort of like shoot your shot, right? You have an answer now. What it is that you would do. But if as is likely, they're like, we have one character artist, and it's gonna take her 6 weeks to do one of a pass on one of these characters. You're like, oh, fine. Well, then maybe all of those henchmen go away, but that's okay. I can still. And then someone else says like, okay, well, we are not going to have any type of VO. So what's the cascade then? You're like, okay. Can we reuse existing VO? Can I like split lines or something? Can I cobble together pieces of what I have? And they're like, no, you can't do that. I'm like, okay, what is the medium with which I'm conveying narrative at this moment? Is it through text? Okay, maybe I can do that. And if you can't do any of that, and you can put like text in a codex entry that you might find it moving through this space. You're like, okay, well, there is always a place for the water to keep falling, right? Like if it cascades to the very bottom, there's still likely some way that you can convey that scene as long as everyone knows what the trade-offs are and what it could have been. But that exact same thing is true at the company level, right? At the project level, at like, if you don't have the ability to sort of tell the story you're trying to tell in a video game to the level of quality that you want, that doesn't mean you can't do it, right? Just like you say, maybe you can test it out, learn a bunch at the tabletop level before you do it anywhere else. Maybe you can write yourself a script in ink or something, or in whatever your preferred platform is, Yarn Spinner or something like this, right? And you work out like, okay, I can figure this stuff out before I ever go to another department. You know, you can always cascade things down. You can always find a way of doing it in a simpler way. And I think sometimes we get stuck here because I know you've talked about this hourglass quote before in previous episodes. It's the same quote that has been ringing in my head for years, right? For like more than a decade, of how your taste tends to outpace your ability to produce. And it's even more than just that, because it's the taste is necessary, right? Like your desire, you are inspired by the things that are the coolest things that you have experienced, right? Those are the things that inspire you to want to create something at that level that are that cool, right? But if you only focus on that headline and you don't see all of the other ways that studios with less budget or less capacity or maybe less in-house talent to do something attempted to solve a very similar problem, you won't have other cards in your hand to put down when you were told that you can't play spades or something, right? So if you can't do the sort of most expensive thing that you're trying to do, but that's all you have in your head is that's your only model, your only mental model for how to solve this problem, you'll be stuck.
Right.
And I think this happens to people all the time. They're like, the games that I like the most, that I'm most inspired by, are games with really intricate backstories, where there's plenty of time for us to have loads of chats with every single NPC, and we can understand everything about who they are. And you're like, well, that's the type of character I'm making. All of my characters are going to be just like this, and we'll have loads of backstory, and they're going to talk about it every opportunity. But then your sort of creative director and producer tell you, these are side characters who are going to appear for half an hour of gameplay in a game that is 20 hours long, and they are not that relevant. They are simply here to service this particular job. You have spent your effort badly. Like that's what it means, right? Like you need a mental model that's like, what's the problem that this specific thing is trying to solve, that this section of the narrative needs to fix. So I've been mixing my metaphors here, right? But whether you are talking about sort of a specific narrative problem in games, whether you were talking about the game as a whole, or whether you were looking at sort of the business, the company overall that you are, the studio that you are working with, or that the project you're trying to pitch, the same cascade applies all the way through of you informing yourself with the different ways you can accomplish your goal, even if that involves a number of trade-offs.
That's brilliant. I have all kinds of side questions that I want to have, but that's like a whole nother episode. Like I'm curious though, when in a situation like that where there's that cascade and you're having to set aside pieces that you just can't execute because of scope or cost. Is there space for some of that to go into environmental storytelling? Can you take these characters you couldn't work with and you can put them into the background somehow? Is there still use there?
Of course there is. It's simply one other tool you have, right? It's one of these in one of the various metaphors I just gave you, right? It's one of the cards you can play. Right. But that card itself might be the thing that's too expensive, right? Like environmental art is not always cheap. It is often, maybe, it depends on the environment, I suppose, cheaper than a cutscene, but maybe not always, right? Like maybe making a new asset, there's just no time for that. That would take your lead artist, it would take them a whole sprint to work on, and you have a milestone due in 3 sprints, and that artist is needed for every single one of those things. So you're like, cool, what do? We've already bought a certain pack in Unreal that we already have access to that has a bunch of existing assets. Can we take it and like make a couple minor adjustments and use this thing that tells the story? We had this big debate over this sequence in Siren's Rest. So Siren's Rest is a DLC for Still Wakes the Deep. It's a horror game that's set in the bowels of the North Sea. You are sort of swimming through and trying to make sense of all these sort of this destruction you find and all these bodies you discover. And it's all a reflection of the base game in which you saw that destruction happen and you saw those bodies and what happened to them before. So I was the lead writer for this project. and a leap for narrative. And there were plenty of these moments where we would sort of say, we want to convey that this destruction happened because, I don't know, a large tank fell through the floor, many floors in a row, and caused it essentially opened the golden path that we need the player to go on. We need the player to be able to swim through, and we think that's a cool moment. We want them to be able to like go down into the depths, but inside of a building that itself is inside of the sea. That's the moment we wanted. And so, I had this plan that we would get to the very bottom, and then we would have a bunch of dialogue that would happen. Our main character would comment, where she would see the tank that has fallen down through, and she would say, "Oh my God, like this must be the reason that this has all happened," right? And you would be able to sort of see it. You'd be able to sort of look back up and be like, "I see. It's logically coherent. The environment has conveyed this to me." Then we had a similar constraint. It wasn't a budgetary constraint in this case. I did record that line, but we couldn't use it because it turned out that the space in my head was what the player would do. Was to be slower than it turned out to be natural to be, right? Even when I would play through it, I would just kind of zip through that area. You would barely spend a load of time. So that's the problem you're confronted with. You're like, my players they don't really have the time and they don't really notice, but to what degree do I want them to care about this specific thing? So that's your first question. Like, what's the answer you want? So, I didn't care about it that much. I liked it. I thought it was kind of a cool idea. But it ultimately didn't work that much. So we were like, what if we just cut the line of dialogue, but we have sort of an optional interact moment. So a player who is looking around might be able to sort of see the tank, click on it, so to speak, and then hear a line of dialogue rather than it just happening as you enter the space. So then it seems to reflect what the player is doing. Okay, maybe it's still kind of long. Is it still doable? But then even literally the tank that we had in mind turned out not to fit in the space. It was actually all just a lot smaller than expected. And we couldn't easily shrink the tank. We couldn't shrink the asset, the 3D asset, because this was a game that was a DLC. It was based off of a previous game. Right. It would be inconsistent with what the size of the tank was from the previous thing. It was like a specific item from the previous game. So you're like, well, you can't change that. Okay, what do you do then? You could cut it. You can move it separately, right? But environmental storytelling solution it's not like an either or, right? It's intermingled with this narrative solution. And like ultimately what mattered, like you come back to what your central touchstones are for a project or for a scene or for a moment. What is it overall? What's the mood of that section of the game? And in that section of the game, like nothing truly dangerous has yet happened. But we want players to start to feel increasing tension. It was actually better for players not to be too bogged down or slowed down just yet. They've had loads of opportunities for that. They're about to get to a moment that's going to be slightly more perilous, and we don't want to get in their way. So I cut all of it, actually. So we ended up not having anything. And that was a perfectly fine solution. And that was like a shot to save to spend in a chit to save to spend in another area. Where it was sort of better focused. That's a really micro example, but it's the type of thing that just happens. It just happens all the time in whether you're in a narrative role or in sort of any other role in games. It's a constant. But the people who are new to the industry, their minds are often full of what's the game idea that I'm going to come up with that's going to be amazing. Like you're sort of thinking at a scale that is good. You don't want to lose that, but you've also got a job to do, like a specific job to do, like a specific problem to solve in this moment, in this instant, and you need to I think a better model for thinking about what to do here isn't like what's the coolest game that I want to make in my career. You should always have that to think about to motivate you in the long run, but in the specifics, it should be about the cards. Like what are the specific tools I have? What are the specific things I can put down within my constraints, within the sort of department I'm in, within the tool set I've got, within the abilities I have. And you won't know that when you start a new job. You have to inform yourself of that by getting to know the tech setup of the environment of your specific game, getting to know the other team members. What are they good at? What are they interested in? They'll just tell you, like, you know what? Dealing with, I don't know, VO for a new character is a big faff. It's so difficult to deal with. If there's any way you can avoid adding a sort of alternate character voice or something and reuse something that you already have, try to do that. If you never ask that question, you might not know, right? So you sort of fill your hand. Yeah, you draw cards, so to speak. The more you talk to these other team members, the more you sort of understand what's happened for the project in the past, and then you try to deploy those things, right? You sort of play them as they come up when they come up. So yeah, no, I mean, I like, my studio is particularly known for environmental storytelling. Like, we really fill these spaces in a way that feel really immersive and I think really lived in. I think it's something that I was really impressed with for the studio. I think it does really, really, really well, especially so in the game that we're about to release in Bloodlines 2. It's just so dense with information. There's so many little secrets and stories, and so many of the things you see aren't necessarily going to be commented on with dialogue, or even with codex entries. They might just be something only you as a player are the one to have noticed, and that's great. Like that's lovely. That's a special moment. It's cool.
I'm curious if the application, when you sit down to paint, every painting, you're not trying to make your masterpiece. You're trying to learn a new technique or refine a technique.
Completely.
But then when you compare that to games where it's the scale is so much larger, the investment of your time in your life, you're only going to make, 10 games if you start early?
I think about this all the time. Yes. I think about this all the time.
I can knock out 10 paintings in a day if all I'm trying to do is figure out a technique or play with a new medium or something. So there is a difference there, but
I really, the more I've come to appreciate the formality of the thousands of years of human civilization we have of formally studying visual art, I wish we had something that the rest of us got even like a taste of that. Frankly, I think it's so good, like the way that you can be classically trained in art, that if game developers learn even that specific thing, if they sort of go through the typical intro process of learning, oh yeah, you're not just born with talent, you have to practice. There's a way you can do it. Don't get too excited about perfecting every drawing. Learn figure, learn gesture, learn all of these things, right? It makes you a better game maker, because the truth is exactly right. We have this huge disadvantage that you make so few games in your career that we're not the only people like that, right? Like I said, I used to work in politics, right? In the States, a presidential election comes around every 4 years. There's nowhere near enough for any person in their life to learn how to do that well, learn how to predict it well, learn how to sort of campaign well, whatever it is, right? But you can borrow some learnings in the game dev process by repeating in the small microcycle other things that are helpful to you, and definitely how you convey something or what is helpful. What's a good visual comparison? It really does aid you, I think.
Well, I'm going to bring you back to it's done. But I mean, we've got so much here today about the narrative cascade and business and working as a creative in the space that, I mean, there's an episode here already, so I don't want to drag people on too long. But it is October. Let's touch quickly on horror, and hey, let's talk about what you are used to, the environmental storytelling, and pull the narrative cascade in with one big question. When you're working on horror and you have limited narrative tools, say you've started to cascade, you had things stripped away, what are the essential elements? Where do you put your effort and your resources to make sure that you're conveying horror, that you're making people feel scared?
I love this. Okay. So in some ways, I've come to appreciate that it's a lot easier in horror than it is in many other genres. And the reason for that is, like a detective story, like a mystery, horror is incredibly structured. There are very specific models you can look at, and there's almost always some recent, quite good evocation of a given way of doing horror. So I think while it can feel crass, thinking about the horror you're making in terms of other references, even if it feels oversimplified, is very helpful. So I will be able to give you a specific example from Siren's Rest. So Siren's Rest is a horror game that is a DLC to a previous horror game, Still Wakes the Deep. They are different types of horror games. It was very important to us that we were really specifically aware, conscious, and repeating to ourselves how and where were they different. Still Wakes the Deep is a sort of cosmic horror, body horror.
Cthulhu.
Yeah. Most of all, it leans on monster horror, right? It is inspired by The Thing. It uses the same system of, you are in a limited space. You are disempowered. You don't know about the sort of threats available to you. You don't know about what you can do. You are surprised by the situation, and then you have to react. So you start to learn, okay, the horror is in these reactions. That's the core of that story, right? Siren's Rest is a totally different story. It's a story of people who are choosing to go into a haunted house. That's also a trope. That's a very specific type of story. Shirley Jackson has like plenty of stories about this type of thing, right? Like you can find plenty of these done very, very well. That's paranormal horror. Paranormal horror is totally different, right? In paranormal horror, like things move in the corner of your vision when you're least expecting it. In paranormal horror, you hear and see hints of what's going to happen, but you almost never see it. In some ways, that's the opposite of body horror, of monster horror, that is, right? In monster horror, it's held back. And there are some things that are consistent. In horror, in general, you want to avoid showing the threat because the repetition of that threat is really consistent, is really obvious. In most types of horror in games, you want to have a tightrope of the player feeling totally in peril. Well, based on your pacing, not always, right? But you want them to be feeling in peril, but not dying. This is a unique issue for horror games that you don't see in other media, right? Because they can control what their players do, right? What their protagonists do. But if a player is constantly dying over and over and over again, all of the horror vanishes, right? Because you're like, oh, it's not that bad. I can just reload a checkpoint. It's right. So that's like the sort of secret sauce in games. Is like, how can you make someone feel, really? I felt this way when I was playing Alan Wake 2, when I was like, I was playing Alan Wake 2 as we were making Siren's Rest, and I was like, these geniuses at Remedy, they're so good, right? Like they're so good. Like you go through Alan Wake 2 feeling exactly this. Like you are constantly about to be killed, but you kind of quite rarely die, actually. Like you don't often completely fall apart. And so that they know how to like just keep that violin moving on that bowstring and never quite like letting it like fall off, right? So that's a pretty consistent thing about horror in games consistently. But I think if you know your subgenre of horror, you know what the general rules are of that, you absolutely can break them, but do it consciously, right? So if you don't have any budget, if you've fallen out of the narrative cascade and you're like, I can't do anything anymore, well, frankly, you might have to cut a scene, right? Like that's feasible. You might have to just cut a section of content, but you might end up being able to make use of one of the elements of your subgenre to your benefit. You're like, hey, if what you fell down on was I don't have the budget to make, I wanted to make 4 enemies, and I don't have the budget to even make, I think we'll barely make 1. You're like, fine, you can absolutely remake your concept around there being one central, truly scary enemy rather than a whole bunch of other ones. Or someone tells you, you know what, we have to reuse the sort of vermin enemies that we had, like a bunch of animals that come and attack you in swarms or something. I think like A Plague Tale does this, right? But we don't have budget to make a new category of enemy, right? We just can't do it anymore. You have to reuse what's already happened here. How can I make them look fresh and unique or different? It depends on what you're doing. If it's gothic horror, like maybe just in quantity, right? It's usually relatively cheap to like duplicate the same asset over and over and over again, right? Like maybe you can do a change in scale. Maybe you can do a change in sort of moment or surprise. Like jump scares are not the only tool in your arsenal, right? So the same metaphor of inform yourself of what the different cards you can have that are in your hand, and then pay them down, right? Like at the right moments in the right way without overuse.
Is this a situation where narrative skills, where you can come in and hook narrative hooks and make people care, and then you can ratchet up the horror without adding a whole bunch of assets or scope? It's like, if I can make you really care about this character and then put them in peril, you're going to be much more scared than if I make them look good and the monster's big and scary, right?
Yeah, totally. That's absolutely it's another tool in your arsenal. If you are doing a horror game where it matters who those characters are, right? Like there is plenty of horror where the very throwaway nature of the characters matters. Like there's some sort of there are some forms of like nihilistic horror where you actually want this sense that everyone is expendable. Like everyone's kind of like wasted. You almost don't want you could then use the contrast. You could have. So I led narrative for a brief period of time on Helldivers 2. Very different type of game than many of these other ones, right? Yeah. And Helldivers 2 is just a totally different game. It's a big multiplayer game. It's a shooter, but it's a game that uses horrific elements sometimes. And the most horrific element is something that is played for laughs almost always when you first hear it. And as it repeats, it starts to sink in for most players that like this is pretty dark, right? So Helldivers 2 is sort of set in this like futuristic world version of the galaxy where there is a version of government that is very fascistic, but uses the trappings of democracy everywhere that they go, right? Mm-hmm. And one way that they're militarily fascistic, right? So one way that they do this is you play a Helldiver, this completely normal person that is like thrown in front of these horrific alien threats, right? So you have the ability, say, to like decide what your character's build is and like what their voice is and all of these things. But the second you get put into a mission and you die, a new Helldiver is brought in for your new life, right? For the next life that you have. It's not the one that you've decided. It's some other poor soul who has just been defrosted and sent down to this planet as a throwaway body because you were all red shirts. Like none of you actually matter to the you're just being fed into the maw of this machine, right? Like that is a horrific concept, right? Like that's a terrible thing. And that's sort of like catch in your throat of like is that really what they're doing? That was exactly the feeling we wanted people to have, right? But so yeah, like that was a case where we sort of intentionally didn't individualize the characters. We like specifically kept them as not ciphers exactly, but as archetypes, so that you would sort of feel this. You would feel over time this sense that like you in the course of gameplay are throwing away their lives, just as the government is inside of it. So yeah, no, it depends. But I mean, nowadays I tend to work on projects that are consciously very narratively focused. And so yes, absolutely, most of the time we tend to like really inhabit our characters and then have something be taken away from them or have something done to them that doesn't require a new monster necessarily. Right?
Brilliant. Well, my friend, I think we're gonna bring this one to the close. I am gonna get you to come back because we need to talk about some of those things. But before we head for the door, I do have a couple of quick things that I like to do for fun. One of them is this philosophical question I've asked everybody who's come on the show for a very long time now, and it's your turn. So here it is. In my opinion, there's a magical space at the intersection of obviously story and game, but improv, comic book writing, film, tabletop role-playing games, where everybody who's involved can just meet, get along. There's a fellowship, shared language. If you agree with my little theory, not everybody does, but if you do, what's the magical thread that would hold a space like that together?
So I've heard you ask this question before. I've been thinking about it. And I'm always struck in the way that you ask this question that you talk about the people coming together over it, right? Because there are sort of different types of games, but many people will play games totally solo. It is an individual experience, right? But implicit in your question is that there's sort of a space we come together, whether in that moment or maybe afterwards speaking about it, or that there's some relationship to it. And I think for that to work, because it clearly does, it clearly works for so many of us, so many times, safety is inherent to that, right? You have to feel vulnerable enough to be able to share something that you are open to. You mentioned improv, right? To be able to put yourself out there, to be able to sort of say something and hope that the other person picks it up. I used to be really into dance. I was in a dance troupe. I did kind of all these other things, and there was nothing more vulnerable than showing your body on a stage, right? And having to move it and let other people tell you if you did a good job or not, right? It was so important that you sort of build up your ability to actually drop your defenses, right? Build the capacity to sort of be calm and say, I really liked Diddy Kong Racing. Did you? You know, and if you can find someone who does, and you can share this sort of moment, it would not have happened had you not felt safe enough to be able to take that first step. So, that's my answer.
That's a good answer. That's a really good answer. Yeah. How does I've never had the chance to ask somebody with such a strong political background who's put time inside the political space.
Yeah.
If you were to put that hat back on for 3 seconds, what are your thoughts around that sacred space, the magic circle, as we call it, that community from a political point of view or a sociological point of view? Is there?
Yeah. I mean, this is why I moved. This is why I shifted industries, because very often the political spaces or say a legal environment, they're built purposefully around adversarial relationships. And the idea is that in the course of the tumult of one side against another, a more interesting outcome will arrive, or a better depending on who is framed, whatever the rules are, what you're working on. They're still working within rules, right? Like there's still some sort of game structure and there's some sort of situation that's happening. We as game makers, we often tend to exclude the most popular games, period, that are played by people around the world, and that's sports, right? Like, and sports are very often, not always, but almost always set up in an adversarial setup where people agree on a set of rules to sort of play together and to come to some sort of outcome that is better or positive, right? So in that way, it's really similar to politics. And both of those things don't use vulnerability as their watchword, right? Like in both of those things, it's a little bit about, it's almost more like you want to enter prepared. Whatever it is that you're trying to do, you want to sort of enter prepared. You don't have to, loads of people don't, but you typically will do better if you have a plan and you have an approach that you are trying to put into effect, whether in sport or in politics, right? And what I love about games, and what brought me to that, is that whole level of vitriol and intensity. It doesn't need to be there. we choose to do these other things, right? And that would be true for sports as well. Absolutely, right? Like you choose to sort of enter the space and to work in this field. And I think with it, you almost lose an element of artifice that you might experience in another area. You don't have many people who build long-term careers in games or who really work to make them. And as a result, this is perhaps slightly adjacent to your question originally of the people who choose to play in these things. But if we just talk for a second about the sort of professionals who are committing their careers to it or committing their lives to it in a serious way, they're usually not going into it for the money, right? They're usually not going into it necessarily for the prestige. They're not telling themselves some grand story that like, oh, this is gonna be the savior of my nation because I'm doing this thing. Like you don't need that extra baggage. Like you're usually there because you're trying to produce art. So you're trying to express yourself in a certain way or do something cool that it reminds you of something that you saw when you were a kid, but hopefully you can do better or your own way or something. Like there's something almost a bit more honest about that, and it means that it's easier to be vulnerable, right? Because all of us, by default of entering the industry, we've already implicitly said to one another, we are doing the slightly harder thing, the thing that is less straightforward to explain to someone else, the thing that doesn't necessarily make us as much money, the thing that like maybe other people will not really find out about, the thing that is transient, right? That like, are people going to be playing my game in 100 years? Like probably not. That's okay, but it's still worth it for me, right? Like you need to know your intrinsic motivators a little bit better, and it is less easy to have the wool pulled over your eyes by a story you tell yourself about how great and grand you are. So this is partially what drew me to this field. It took me a long time to admit that to myself, I think, but this is part of why I'm so happy working in the work I do.
It's a damn good reason, man. It's a damn good reason. All right, well, we're going to head for the door here. I do like to open a little space up for signal boosting. Is there anything you've worked on or are working on that you'd like to mention, or where can people find you and follow you online? Hit me with what's going on.
Yeah, good question. The truth is, as a parent these days, I'm not incredibly active online. You are much more successful at this than I am. Things are always works in progress. I go to my website and I'm like, oh, I only ever update this when I'm trying to get a job, and so it's inevitably like 5 years out of date or something, right? So no, I don't have too much of an online presence to be able to signal boost, but I do work for an amazing studio, the Chinese Room, that works really, really hard, full of incredibly talented people, and we are about to release this big title that I've referred to, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. I hope whether you know the IP or you don't, you might be willing to some of the listeners might be willing to sort of go in and think about it. I myself haven't worked on it. I haven't written for it or sort of done anything for the title that's coming out, but there's some amazing people who have, and I think it's a pretty good title. As for what I have worked on, I've talked during this call a fair bit about Siren's Rest, the DLC to Still Wakes the Deep. I think the original Still Wakes the Deep is extraordinary, and if you sort of play that and then play a little bit of the DLC, it's very short actually. I'd love to know what you think. Maybe you can find me on LinkedIn and send me a message or something, or add a comment on the podcast comment section or something. So yeah, that'd be lovely for people to experience.
Perfect. Excellent. I have played Still Wake the Deep, so I haven't got the DLC fired up yet, but it's in my queue. So
cool. Yeah. Tell me what you think if you get around to it. Yeah.
I will. Oh, I will. Oh, I will. All right. Well, I'm going to push you out the door, but I do like to give the last word to the guest. So as you head out the door, do you have any parting words of wisdom? It could be life, it could be parenting, craft, creative, drink recipe. Hit me with something.
We've been talking a lot about sort of business and the structure of games and like all of these like kind of big heady topics. And I guess what I want to say is these things are a long game. A career is a long time. If you are interested in making games and you are demoralized or you've been recently laid off or things have not gone really, really well, this need not be your only shot at it, right? This need not be the one opportunity you have. That's not how careers work. If you have the ability at some point to come back or to stay interested, you may well have another opportunity. I find that ultimately in the long run, perseverance tends to trump luck in most situations if you're in an environment where these things can be taken up. So, I hope that people who are hurting from the current period of the industry will soon see a sort of brighter light a little while later. There's much to come, and there's still extraordinary games being made. So the sort of inspiration fuel machine need not stop.
And that wraps up another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. First of all, Sagar, thank you for taking us inside the creative trenches, where horror is built not just with blood and monsters, but with creativity, empathy, and narrative grit. And to you, dear listener, as always, thank you for taking your seat at the table. If this conversation sparks something in you, please share it with your friends, colleagues, your dev team. You never know who might need to hear this. Until next time, keep telling stories, playing games, and creating worlds worth getting lost in. Stay safe out there, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the Corner of Story and Game.